The smoke was still rising from the eastern ridge when I rode back through what was left of Asheville Crossing. 3 hours. That was how long the enemy had held the pass before my captains drove them back into the dark between the trees. 3 hours, and the crossing's outer garrison looked as though a winter storm had swept through it sideways. Beams down, the stone arch of the old watchtower cracked clean through. 6 of my wolves stretched out on the frozen ground, and the smell of scorched wood and cold blood thick enough to taste. I had fought in 32 engagements over as many years. I knew what a contested pass looked like the morning after. I had grown accustomed to it in the way that a man grows accustomed to any particular weight he has carried long enough. What I had not grown accustomed to, what I had, in fact, never seen in 32 years of war, was the woman kneeling in the mud beside my most gravely wounded soldier, one hand pressing a folded cloth against the ragged gash above his ribs, the other holding a clay cup of something dark and steaming to his lips, speaking to him in a voice so low and steady that it cut right through the wind. She was not one of my healers. I knew every face in my field corps. She was not a villager from Asheville. Those families had evacuated 3 days ago when the enemy's scouts were first spotted in the valley. She was not wearing a pack sigil, not dressed in healer's gray, not carrying the leather satchel that my own medical officers wore across the chest. She wore a plain traveling coat, the hem of it dark with mud and worse, her hair pulled back without ceremony, and she was entirely, utterly focused on the man bleeding in front of her, as though the ruined arch behind them and the creak of settling timber and the distant sound of my captains reorganizing their companies were simply not her concern. My Lieutenant Bren rode up beside me and followed my gaze. "She was here when the first wave came through," he said. "Apparently she was on the road from the border settlement at Velt when the line collapsed. She didn't run. She pulled Talvin and 2 others out of the far ditch while the fighting was still in the pass." He paused. "Sir, she pulled them out while the fighting was still in the pass." I dismounted. I had intended to walk to Talvin. He was one of my most experienced border guards, and the wound above his ribs was the kind that could go either way, and assess the situation with my own eyes before making any decisions about the morning's next movement. That was what I had intended. Instead, I stopped a few feet from her and watched. She had already packed the wound cleanly. She was monitoring his breathing now, one hand resting lightly at his wrist, timing something. As I watched, she adjusted the angle of his head on the rolled cloak she had placed beneath it, said something quiet to him that made him exhale slowly and close his eyes, and then she looked up. Her eyes were gray. Not the pale, washed-out gray of the northern winter sky, a deep, still gray, the color of river water in shadow. They settled on me without alarm, without the involuntary flinch that most people offered a king riding up on a battle horse, still flecked with the evidence of the morning's work. She simply looked at me calmly, the way a woman looks at a problem she is still in the middle of solving. "He needs warmth and stillness for the next 6 hours," she said. "The bleeding is controlled, but the rib is cracked, not broken. If you move him before the wound seals, it will open again, and this time it won't close as easily." She glanced back at the man. "He also needs water, more water than he thinks he wants. He'll argue with you about it. Don't let him win the argument." I stared at her for a moment. "Who are you?" I said. "A traveler," she said, which was the least useful answer she could have given me and somehow delivered without the slightest trace of evasion. She meant it plainly. She was a traveler. She had been traveling. Here she was. "You pulled 3 of my wolves out of a ditch during an active engagement." "2 of them would have drowned," she said. "The ditch fills fast. The 3rd one could have managed, but he had a head wound, and I wasn't confident he could keep himself upright in moving water." I looked at her for another moment. There was something happening in my chest. Not the heat of the bond mark that my counsel's seers had described to me in abstract terms over the years, not the dramatic ignition that the old songs referred to with the kind of overwrought imagery that had always made me quietly skeptical. It was quieter than any of that. It was a stillness, as though something that had been held in tension behind my sternum for longer than I could account for had simply paused, gone still. Like a word that had been waiting on the edge of someone's tongue for years, and had just, very quietly, been spoken. I did not know what to make of that. I set it aside. "Come to the command tent," I said. When he settled, she looked at the man Talvin and made what I could see was a quick, precise assessment. Then she stood, tucking the cloth and the cup into the bag at her side, and said, 10 minutes. I gave her 20, because that is how long it took my captains to finish their reports, and because I found, in a way I did not immediately examine, that I wanted her to take whatever time she needed. Her name was Senna. She told me this when she arrived at the command tent with the same economy of presentation she appeared to give everything. She came in, sat down when I indicated the chair, and told me her name in the same tone she might have used to report the weather. No title, no pack affiliation. No explanation for how she came to be on the border road, during the worst engagement the Eastern Pass had seen in 11 years. "Where is your pack?" I asked. "I don't have one," she said, not with shame, not with the kind of careful casualness that people use to cover pain, simply as a fact that had been true long enough that she no longer found it particularly remarkable. I had heard this kind of answer before, and I had always known, with the instinct of a man who has governed a kingdom through difficult decades, when there was more to it. There was more to it. "Where are you from?" I said. Originally, she considered this with what seemed to be genuine thought. "The Veldfen border settlements. My mother was a midwife. She taught me what she knew." A brief pause. "She died when I was 17. I've been moving between the border communities since." "Alone?" "Yes." "How long?" She looked at me steadily. She was, I estimated, somewhere in her middle 20s. There was a quality to her composure that was older than her face, the particular stillness of someone who had been managing difficult circumstances on their own for long enough that equanimity had ceased to be an effort and simply become a posture. 8 years, she said. 8 years, alone, moving along the border settlements with no pack affiliation, no protection, no name attached to a house or a territory. Doing this, pulling bleeding men out of flood ditches during raids, holding cups of medicinal tea to the lips of strangers, speaking in that even, unruffled voice to men whose lives were frightening them. The stillness behind my sternum deepened. I ignored it. "I need field healers on the Eastern Ridge," I said. "My medical corps is stretched. 3 engagements in 4 days." She looked at me without expression. "Are you offering me a position?" "I'm asking if you're willing." The distinction mattered to her. I could see it in the small shift of something in her gray eyes, a kind of careful attending. She was used to things being taken from her. Offer and demand had blurred long ago. She was deciding whether I understood the difference between them. "Yes," she said at last. "I'm willing." That was how it began. Not in ceremony, not in the formal weight of a hall, with the pack arrayed in their finery and the old mate bond traditions performed in correct order. It began in a scorched, enlisting command tent on the frozen edge of the Eastern Pass, with a woman in a muddy travel coat deciding to trust the word of a king who had offered her a choice and waited for her answer. I should say here what I could not have said then, because I did not know it then. The border settlements at Veld, where Senna had been born, were not simply the scattered communities of small farmers and river traders that they appeared to be on any territorial map. They were, or had been, the remnant of something much older. A bloodline that the old kingdom of Ashenveld, my kingdom's predecessor, the territory that had existed before my grandfather's grandfather, united the northern packs under one crown, had tried very hard, over several generations, to scatter. I did not know this in those first days. My historians knew fragments of it. My oldest seer, a woman named Korath who had served my father and his father before him, knew rather more than fragments. She had not as yet told me. What she had told me, years earlier, in a conversation I had filed away as the abstract concerns of the very old, was this: that there existed, somewhere in the territories my kingdom now held, a bloodline marked by the oldest moon seal known to the northern packs. Not the ceremonial seals that my pack's records used to track bloodline claims to territory. The original, the one that predated territory claims altogether. The one that, according to every historical account that had survived the unification wars, could not be manufactured, could not be inherited sideways, could not be granted by any ceremony. It could only be born. And the last recorded bearer had died, or so the records indicated, 112 years ago, in the collapse of the old Ashenveld court. I had listened to Korath explain this with the patience I gave all things she told me, attentively, with genuine respect, and without entirely believing that it was information I would ever need to act upon. That was before Senna. She spent the first week at the Eastern Ridge doing the work she had apparently been doing all her life, moving from tent to tent, from wounded soldier to wounded soldier, with the same quiet efficiency she had displayed the morning I found her. She did not seek attention. She did not seek approval. She worked, and when the work was done for the day, she sat outside whichever tent she had been assigned and ate whatever was brought to her without comment. The other healers in my corps, professional, trained, somewhat suspicious of the borderland woman who had simply appeared in their ranks, watched her for 3 days before they stopped watching and simply started working alongside her. My senior healer, a meticulous man named Aldrath who had served the Border Corps for 14 years, came to me on the third morning with the look of someone who has revised an opinion he had been fairly confident about. She has a botanical knowledge I have not encountered outside the capital training, he said. She knows 3 binding herb preparations that we do not stock because they require specific cold weather roots from the Veldt Basin that don't travel well. She's been gathering them from the ridgeline herself before first light. He paused. She also appears to have a working understanding of how the wolves' healing differs from the soldiers. She doesn't treat them the same. Another pause. I don't know where she learned that. She grew up in Veldt, I said. That doesn't explain it, Aldrath said, which was his way of saying it did explain it, just not in any way he could account for with his formal training. He went back to work. She ate alone, not from unfriendliness. The garrison soldiers tried more than once to include her in the firing circles that formed after the evening report, but from the particular self-sufficiency of a person who has spent enough years relying on their own company that solitude has become comfortable rather than lonely. I noticed, though, that she was not closed. When soldiers came to her tent in the evening with questions, about a wound that wasn't healing correctly, about what the bitter tea she had given them actually was, about whether the pain in their shoulder was the kind worth reporting to Aldrath, she answered them without impatience or condescension, sitting cross-legged on the ground with her satchel open beside her, giving each person the same quality of attention she gave the most critical case. On the 4th evening, I watched from a distance as one of my youngest border guards, barely 3 years into his service, 18 at most, who had taken a jagged cut on his forearm in the 3rd engagement, sat beside her tent and cried quietly into his hands while she wrapped the arm with clean cloth and said nothing at all, simply working steadily, the way that stillness is sometimes a more useful thing than words. He was back on the line the following morning. He was the soldier who stood closest to the healer compound in every formation after that, without being asked. My wolves watched her differently. I noticed this on the 2nd day, and I noticed it more on the 3rd. And by the 4th day I had stopped pretending I was not paying close attention to it. The wolves of my pack, those that accompanied the border garrison, the scout wolves that ranged the edges of the camp at night, the elder wolves that had been with my family's hold since before I was born, went to her. Not desperately, not in the way that frightened animals seek comfort. Deliberately. They sought her out the way that water seeks its level, with an unhurried certainty. The old gray scout wolf that had refused to let any handler near his shoulder wound, since the first engagement, simply walked up to Senna on the afternoon of the second day, put his head under her hand, and stood there while she examined him. She talked to him while she worked, the same low, even voice she used for everyone, and he watched her face the entire time with an expression that I can only describe as recognition. I told myself I was noting this for practical reasons. A field healer who could work with the wolves as well as the soldiers was a considerable asset. That was what I told myself. Bren came to me on the 5th day and said, with the careful diplomacy of a man who has served me long enough to know when to be careful, "Sir, the wolves slept outside her tent last night. All 4 of them." "I know," I said. "Korath sent a rider," he said. "She's asking to speak with you." I sent for Korath instead. She arrived on the 6th day, riding the small dun horse she had ridden for as long as anyone could remember, her gray robes dusty, and her expression the one she wore when she had been sitting with something important for longer than she was comfortable with. She asked to see the woman from Velt before she said anything to me. I took her to the tent where Senna was working. Korath stood in the entrance for perhaps 30 seconds. She did not speak. She watched Senna work, the sure, careful hands, the low voice, the wolf asleep against the wall with its great gray head tilted toward her as though even in sleep it maintained its orientation to her. And then she turned to me, and her expression was one I had seen on her face perhaps twice in my life. It was not excitement. It was more serious than excitement. It was the face of a woman who has spent her whole life watching for something and has finally seen it. "Come and talk to me," she said quietly, "just us." We walked to the edge of the camp, where the ground rose toward the ridge, and the wind came in cold and clean from the north, and Korath looked out at the ridge for a long time before she spoke. "The mark won't be visible yet," she said. "It rarely is until there is sufficient pressure, crisis. The bloodline wakes under pressure, that is its nature. It was built that way deliberately, generations back, so that it could not simply be identified in peacetime and eliminated." She paused. "But I can feel it in her, even from the doorway. The seal recognizes itself." "It always does." She looked at me sideways. "Your wolf went still when you first saw her." It was not a question. "Something happened," I admitted, which was the most imprecise statement I had made since I was a boy. I couldn't name it then. "Can you name it now?" I thought about the stillness behind my sternum, the sense of a word spoken aloud after years on the edge of someone's tongue. It was as if something came to rest, I said at last. Korath nodded slowly. "The seal-bearers call it the settling," she said. "It is the oldest account we have of how a true mate bond presents itself in a bloodline of this kind. Not the fire, not the dramatic surge. The settling. The sense of a thing that has been in motion for a very long time coming at last to stillness." I said nothing. There was a great deal running through my mind, and very little of it had resolved itself into language yet. "She doesn't know," Korath said. "Whatever her mother told her, and I suspect her mother knew more than she shared, given that she kept the girl in Velt until she died, she doesn't know what she carries." "Will the mark appear?" "I believe it will," Korath said quietly. "The enemy has been pressing harder than simple territory hunger explains. They know the bloodline is in this region. They may not know specifically who carries it, but they know it exists and they are searching. That kind of pressure, sustained, yes. The seal will show itself. It always does when the bearer needs it." She paused again. "The question, my king, is what you will do when it does." I considered this for a long moment. The question had 2 parts, though she had phrased it as one. The first part concerned the kingdom, the strategic and historical implications of an active seal-bearer standing within my borders, within my garrison, and what that meant for the territorial claims the enemy had been building for 15 years. The second part concerned something considerably more personal, and Korath knew it, and she was asking about both. I will do what I should do, I said, which in this case happens to align with what I want to do. Korath's expression shifted very slightly. For a woman who had seen 3 kings from up close, she was remarkably good at not saying what she was thinking. She was thinking, I suspected, that alignment of that kind was rarer than I was making it sound, and that a king who recognized it when it appeared was either very wise or very fortunate. The enemy will press harder when they sense the seal is close to waking, she said. 112 years of their argument that the old covenants are expired, that the Northern Alliance is a historical curiosity with no living sanction, all of it undone in a single night if the seal wakes and is witnessed under the right conditions. She looked at me steadily. Guard her. I already am, I said. Guard her better, she said, which was the most direct criticism she had offered me in 20 years of service, and which I took without argument. I looked out at the ridge. 3 engagements in 5 days. The enemy was not retreating, they were probing, testing my lines, looking for the seam they had not yet found. I had 1,200 wolves on the eastern border and the promise of another 400 from the Southern Alliance by the time the next moon rose. What I did not have was a reason for why the enemy had pressed asterisk this corridor specifically, when 2 other routes would have given them tactical advantages they were not pursuing. They're not here for the pass, I said. No, Korath agreed. They're not. I went back to the camp, and I watched Senna for the remainder of the afternoon with new eyes and old certainty, and a feeling I had no precise word for, a mingling of the steadiness I had always associated with the matter of governing and something else entirely, something warmer and more uncertain, which I was not yet ready to examine too closely. What I did examine, carefully and with full attention, was her safety. I reassigned the tent placement. I restructured the healer compound so that it sat closer to the garrison's inner ring rather than its edge. I shifted 2 of my most reliable border wolves, veterans, good judgment, the kind who did not startle and did not need much instruction, to a quiet patrol rotation around the healer's area. I told Bren it was a general security upgrade. Bren looked at me with the expression of a man who has known me for 20 years and said, "Yes, sir," without inflection, which was how I knew he had noticed everything. Senna herself noticed the change on the second morning after it was implemented. I happened to be crossing the compound when she emerged from her tent and stopped, took in the new configuration of the patrol with a single calm sweep of her gray eyes, and then looked directly at me across 20 feet of frost-rimed ground. I kept walking. Behind me, I heard Bryn make a sound that was not quite a cough. On the 8th day she found me. I was at the ridgeline in the early evening, after the day's last report, standing at the point where my captains had staked the furthest sightline markers. I came here most evenings. It was the highest ground, and from it I could see the full spread of the valley below, the camp laid out in its ordered rings, the dark tree line where the enemy lurked and probed, the pale line of the road that ran back through Asheville toward the interior of the kingdom, toward home. I heard her footsteps. She was not trying to be quiet, and I turned. She came up the last few yards of the ridge and stood beside me, not uncomfortably close, not at the careful distance of a formal approach, simply beside me. She looked out at the valley for a moment. "You moved the healer compound," she said. "Security adjustment," I said. She looked at me sideways. She did not argue with this. She said, "The patrol on the east side, the gray wolf with the notched ear. He's been sitting outside my tent since the second night." "That is Korath's observation as well," I said. "Who is Korath?" "My seer. She arrived yesterday." Senna was quiet for a moment. "She came to see me," she said. "She stood in the doorway for a while. She didn't say anything." "No," I agreed. "She rarely says things when she's first confirming them." Senna looked at the valley. The last light was sitting low on the ridge line, turning the frost-covered ground a pale bronze. Her breath misted in the cold air. She was not wearing enough for the temperature. A healer's reflex, I suspected, to keep her hands unencumbered and her arms free to move. I removed my outer cloak, which was lined with wolf fur, and held it out. She looked at it, she looked at me. A king does not generally lend his cloak to a border healer without some consideration of the optics, she said, which was so precise and unexpectedly dry that something in my chest eased in a way I had not felt in a long time. I find that I am less concerned with optics than I used to be, I said. Take the cloak. She took the cloak. She held it for a moment, then settled it around her shoulders with a practicality that I suspected was her default mode for receiving things. Her hands emerged from the front of it and she looked down at them briefly, both bare, the fingers slightly reddened from the cold, and then out at the valley again. "What is it that the wolves know about me?" she said. Not a question exactly, more the shape of something she had been holding quietly for some time, placed down between us. I owed her honesty. I had known this since the first evening, and the 8 days between then and this moment had not changed it. "Korath believes you carry a very old bloodline mark," I said. "The oldest one recorded in the Northern Territories. A moon seal that predates the kingdoms, predates the pack alliances, predates almost everything except the land itself." I paused. "She believes it is the reason the enemy has been pressing this corridor specifically, though they likely don't know precisely who they're looking for." She took this in without flinching. Most people, when told something large about themselves, either reject it immediately or reach for it with a kind of hunger. She did neither. She simply held it, the way she held everything, I was coming to understand, with the steady attention of a woman who does not make decisions in a hurry because she has learned, through experience, that the decisions she makes in a hurry tend to cost her. "What does the seal mean?" she said. "For the kingdom, in plain language, not the ceremony language." I considered how to say it plainly. "The northern packs have been united under one crown for 4 generations, I said. "The argument for that unity, the reason the individual holds accepted it, the reason the alliances have held, runs partly through treaty and partly through something older. The seal-bearer's presence in the oldest accounts is described as the land's own ratification. Not a king choosing to claim authority, but the territory itself acknowledging the bond. When the seal wakes and is witnessed, it says, 'This is the right union, in the right time, in the right place.' The enemy's claim to this corridor rests on arguing that the old covenants are spent, that the Northern Union is a political arrangement like any other, to be renegotiated by force. An active seal-bearer standing here removes that argument entirely." I paused. "And the seal does not transfer. It cannot be taken. It belongs to the bloodline that carries it, and the bloodline chooses its own ground." She looked at her hands again. "It chose a border healer," she said, with a flatness that might have been self-deprecation if there had been any bitterness behind it. There was none. It was simply an observation. "It chose well," I said. The silence that followed was not the silence of disbelief. It was the silence of a woman rearranging a great many things that she had long held in one configuration, and was now slowly understanding had always been arranged differently. "My mother," she said at last, "used to tell me not to go near the border ceremonies. Not the public ones, not the private ones. She never explained why. She was still looking at her hands. When she was sick near the end, she said something. I thought she was confused. She said, 'The seal will know when it's time. Don't fight it when it comes.'" A long pause. I didn't know what it meant. "Did you ask her?" "She was gone by morning." She said this without self-pity, simply as a fact. The fact of a girl of 17 left alone in a border settlement with her mother's herbal knowledge and no explanation. I said nothing. There was nothing that needed to be said about that particular grief that would not reduce it to something smaller than it was. I simply stood beside her on the ridgeline, while the last of the light went out of the valley, and the stars came in cold and close overhead, and the wolves at the camp's edge moved in their slow night patrol, and the enemy waited in the dark of the tree line for whatever they were waiting for. "The mark," she said eventually. "If what she said is right, that it comes when the time is right, what does it look like when it comes?" "Korath describes it as a luminescence," I said. "Something that appears at the wrist or the sternum. Ancient accounts describe it as a silver light, like the moon reflected in still water. Unmistakable." She looked down at the inside of her right wrist. Even in the dark I could see nothing there, only the pale lines of her skin, the fine map of tendons and cold flushed blood. "Not yet," I said. "Not yet," she agreed. She gave me back the cloak before she left, folded it neatly, and held it out with both hands in a gesture that was somehow both practical and, in a way I did not know how to name, formal. As though she were returning something she intended to be able to accept again under better circumstances. I took it, our hands brushed. The stillness behind my sternum became, briefly, something warmer. "Thank you," I said, "for the men you pulled from the ditch, for the 8 days." She looked at me steadily. "Thank you," she said, "for the distinction between offering and demanding." She walked back down the ridge, and I stood there for some time in the cold after she was gone, watching the lights of the camp below, and thinking about nothing practical whatsoever. The 9th day brought the largest engagement yet. It came at 2 hours before dawn, when the cold was at its deepest and the sentries were at their most strained. The enemy drove 3 columns simultaneously at the eastern face of the pass, not the probing tests of the previous days but a committed push, the kind that either breaks a line or burns itself out trying. My captains were good. My wolves were experienced and angry and defending their own ground. We held. What I did not know, until Bren came to me at a flat run midway through the engagement, was that a 4th column had pushed silently through a narrow ravine 2 miles south, behind our position, and had come up against the inner ring of the camp, directly at the healer compound. I left my position. I should not have. There were decisions being made in the past that required my presence and my judgment, and I left my position and ran, which was not the action of a commanding officer but was, in that moment, the only action I was capable of taking. I had covered perhaps half the distance between the pass and the inner ring when I heard it, not the clash of the engagement in the pass behind me, which I had been tracking by sound for 40 minutes, but something different. Something that the back of my mind registered before the front of it had time to name it. A silence spreading through the camp, moving outward from the inner compound, in the way that a ripple moves across water, not the taut, held-breath silence of soldiers waiting for an order but something else entirely. Something older. The wolves in the outer patrol were changing direction. I could feel it through the ground as much as see it, 50 bodies shifting orientation at once, moving not toward the perimeter but inward, pulled by something I could not yet see. I ran faster. I came through the inner ring's perimeter line and found the garrison wolves already engaged with the column's forward edge, and the healers in the stone building, and Senna standing in open ground, alone and completely still, and the light rising from her wrist, and the enemy's advance line stopped as though struck. For 3 seconds, perhaps 4, I stood at the perimeter and did not move. I was, I will admit, unable to move, not from fear, from something entirely different, from the particular arrest that comes when a thing you have been told about in the abstract, a thing you have believed in the careful, considered way that a man believes in things he has not witnessed, suddenly becomes fully, entirely, undeniably real in front of your eyes. The seal. Her. What Korath had spent her lifetime waiting to see, and what I had been building toward without knowing it since the morning I rode back through the smoke at Asheville Crossing, and found a woman in a muddy coat holding a cup of tea to a bleeding man's lips. I crossed the distance between us. What I found when I broke through the inner ring's perimeter line was this. The 4 veteran wolves I had assigned to the healer area patrol were engaged with the forward edge of the column, holding them, barely, pressed back against the stone wall of the garrison's supply building. The healers had taken shelter inside the building's secondary structure, all except Senna. She was standing in the open ground between the supply building and the enemy's forward edge, which made no tactical sense, and the wolves that were supposed to be inside the building with the other healers were behind her, and she was not running. I started toward her, and then I stopped. Because the light had come. It was not dramatic, the way that the old accounts tended to describe it, with the urgency of people writing about things they could barely believe they had witnessed. It was not a burst, not an explosion of radiance. It was the way that dawn comes sometimes in the Northern Territories, quietly, steadily, beginning so far below the horizon that you almost miss it, and then suddenly, between one breath and the next, the world is changed. The inside of her wrist was glowing. Silver, the color of moonlight on still water, exactly as Koreth had said, and it was spreading, not outward from the wrist but deepening, the light rising from somewhere inside her as though the mark had always been there waiting for precisely this cold, dark morning, and this exact threshold of need. The enemy's forward column had stopped. I had seen a great many things in 32 years of engagements. I had seen wolves stand their ground against impossible odds. I had seen the bond mark flare in a ceremony hall and the whole assembled pack go still. I had seen my father's great wolf rear up, and the sound of it stop an argument between 3 pack leaders that had been building for a month. None of it had looked like this. The enemy's forward line, experienced fighters, battle-hardened, men who had pressed through my line 3 times in 9 days without breaking, had stopped moving. They were not retreating. They were standing as though the sight of her had interrupted some fundamental instruction, as though the light coming from her wrist had said something to them in a language that moved faster than orders and deeper than training. And then the wolves came. Not the 4 assigned to the healer compound. They were still pressed against the supply wall. The pack wolves. The ones from the eastern pass, from the ridge, from the outer patrol. I heard them before I saw them. The sound of 50 wolves moving at speed. And then they came through the gaps in the garrison's outer perimeter like water through broken ground. And they went directly to her. And they arranged themselves between her and the enemy's line in a crescent so precise, it looked like a formation they had drilled for years. The enemy's forward column broke. That is the plainest way I know to say it. They broke, not rooted, not disordered, but deliberately, almost carefully, the way that a force withdraws when it has encountered something outside the parameters of its orders, something that requires different instructions from higher authority. They moved back into the dark ravine, and the night swallowed them. Everything went very quiet. Senna stood in the open ground with 50 wolves around her and the silver light still steady at her wrist, and she was looking at her own hand with the expression of a woman who has just heard, for the first time, the word her mother told her would eventually be spoken. I walked toward her through the wolves. They let me through, not with the deference of animals moving aside for a familiar figure, but with something more deliberate, a quality of acknowledgement, as though they were recognizing a relationship they had been aware of before I had. The eldest among them, the great gray scout wolf, the one who had put his head under her hand on the second day, lifted his head as I passed and looked at me with amber eyes that had always seemed to me to hold rather more than the ordinary complement of wolf thought. I came to stand in front of Senna. She looked up. The silver light was fading now slowly, the way that dawn fades back at the end of winter when the sun climbs but the cold persists, retreating but not gone, laid down somewhere just below the surface of her skin, waiting. "Are you hurt?" I said. "No," she said. "Are you frightened?" She considered this with the same honest attention she gave everything. "I was," she said, "before. When I heard them coming and the other healers went inside, I meant to follow them, and then," she paused. "Then something happened that felt like standing up, not a decision exactly. More like the decision had already been made, somewhere further back than this morning, and I was simply arriving at it." She looked at her wrist. The silver was almost invisible now in the returning darkness, but it was still there, a faint trace, the watermark of something that had woken and would not go fully back to sleep. I think I understand what my mother meant. The seal knows when it's time, I said. Yes, she looked up at me again. Her gray eyes were very steady. What does it mean for the kingdom? For the war. The enemy has been searching for this bloodline because an active seal bearer in the Northern Territories gives the kingdom something they cannot counter and cannot copy, I said. The seal is not a weapon. It is Korath's word is sanction, a confirmation. The land and the pact bond and the oldest covenant of the Northern Territories all running in the same current. When it wakes and is witnessed, it changes what the enemy can claim. It changes what any challenge to this kingdom can stand on. I paused. The reason my grandfather's grandfather united the pacts under one crown was partly because the old seal bearer stood with him. The last account of an active seal was 112 years ago. The records say it ended with the bearer. It did not end. She was quiet for a moment. It just went a velt, she said, with a midwife. It appears so. The wolves around us were settling, lying down, the great gray one turning himself in 3 deliberate circles and lowering his head onto his forepaws, the others following in 1s and 2s, the way that a fire settles when the worst of the wind has passed and what remains is warmth. The garrison was reorganizing at the perimeter. I could hear the sounds of my captains taking reports, the specific cadence of a line that had held and was now accounting for itself. I have a question, Senna said. Ask it. The settling. She said the word carefully, as though she had heard it recently and was testing its weight. That is your word, not mine. I didn't know it until just now. I heard it from Korath this afternoon when I asked her directly what she was watching for. She looked at me with those still gray eyes. She said that the seal and the mate bond are not separable in this bloodline, that the settling the bearer feels is the bond establishing its ground. A pause. Did you feel it? There was no useful purpose served by pretending I had not. On the first morning, I said, when I found you beside Talvin, yes. She nodded once, a small, precise nod, the kind that means I thought so, not I am surprised. She looked at the ground between us, then back up. I don't know what to do with that, she said, which was the most honest statement I had heard anyone make to me in a long time. I have been a traveler for 8 years. I did not expect I am not, she stopped, took a breath, tried again with the direct simplicity she gave everything. I am not a woman who expects to be chosen. The pain in that sentence was not loud. It was the pain of a truth told so many times to oneself that it has worn smooth. 8 years on border roads alone, no pact to name, no ceremony to stand in, no one to sit beside when the cold came in. She had not been rejected by a pack that once held her. She had never been held by one. She had been passed over by the entire structure of the world she lived in, not with cruelty, but with the particular thoughtlessness of institutions that do not see what does not carry the right sigil. I know, I said. I know that is what the world has shown you, and I am aware, I paused, because the next sentence required some care, that I cannot simply stand in a field at 2 in the morning after a repelled column and declare myself, and expect that to mean what declarations of that kind ought to mean. You don't know me. 8 days is not enough. I held her gaze. But I want you to know that what I felt that first morning has not changed. And the seal and the wolves and what happened tonight they matter for the kingdom. They matter in every historical and political sense. And they are entirely separate from what I am telling you now, which is that you were worth choosing before any of that appeared at your wrist. The woman who pulled 3 men from a flood ditch while the fighting was still happening, that is who I am speaking to. The rest is the world recognizing what I already know. She looked at me for a long time. The camp was coming back to life around us. The wolves were fully settled now, the great gray one snoring faintly. From the east ridge I could hear the sound of the pass holding. I would need time, she said at last. I have time, I said. You are not going anywhere I am not, and I am not going anywhere you are not. The eastern border will hold because we will hold it, and after that there will be whatever comes next, and I would find it, I paused again. I would find it considerably better than anything that has come before, if you were beside me for it. Something shifted in her expression, very small, very careful, the first motion of something that had been held still for a long time. Not a smile exactly, something earlier than a smile. A door not yet opened but turned toward. Ask me again, she said, when the pass is held. I will, I said. She reached up and tucked a loose strand of hair back from her face with the back of her wrist, and in doing so turned the inside of that wrist briefly toward me. The silver trace was still there, faint as the memory of moonlight. We stood in the field together while the camp came back to order around us, and neither of us said anything more that night, and it was more than enough. The pass held on the 14th day. It did not hold because of a single decisive engagement. It held the way that most wars in the North are ultimately decided, not in the field, but in the calculus of what becomes too costly to continue. The enemy had pushed the eastern corridor for 2 weeks on the assumption that what they were searching for was loose in the territory, unprotected, either ignorant of its own significance or isolated enough to be taken. When the seal woke on the 9th night, and the pack wolves came down from the ridge and stood in crescent formation around a border healer in a mud-covered coat, that calculation changed. Word travels in war, faster than orders, faster than riders, faster than anyone in command ever quite accounts for. The word that traveled from Asheville Crossing in the days that followed was not the word of a strategic reversal. It was something older and harder to argue with. The northern seal is active. The bearer stands with the king. The land itself has chosen. Whatever the enemy's orders had been regarding the bearer of that bloodline, their command structure did not, apparently, have a protocol for what to do when the seal appeared in the middle of their forward column, and 50 wolves came through the perimeter walls uninstructed. The column that had penetrated the inner ring did not return. The probing actions along the ridge line became less frequent, then stopped. On the 13th day there were no contacts. On the 14th day, Bren brought me a report from the border scouts. The eastern tree line was empty. The enemy had pulled back to their own territory's edge. Korath came to me on the afternoon of the 14th day with her careful expression, and her dun horse standing at the camp entrance, already loaded for the return to the interior. The council will need to be informed, she said. The territorial implications alone will take months to process. The historical claim the seal reopens, the questions of recognition and ceremony. She waved a hand, the gesture of a woman who has spent her life dealing with the institutional machinery of kingdoms and has made her peace with its pace. It will be managed. She knows what she wants, I said. Korath looked at me. Does she? She will, I said, when I ask her. And the asking. When the pass held, I said, those were her terms. Korath's expression was one I had seen perhaps twice in my life, and on neither previous occasion had it been directed at me. It was the expression she wore when something she had been watching for a very long time turned out to be true, and the truth of it was better than she had let herself expect. Your grandmother, she said after a moment, told me something the year before she died that I have kept until now. She said, the king who holds this territory after me will be the one who earns his Luna rather than inheriting her. She said she had seen it in the seal records that the bloodline always chooses and is always chosen, and the choosing is always both at once. She paused. I believe she was right. She rode out of camp an hour later, back toward the interior and the council, and the long, careful work of explaining to old institutions that the world had changed again. I found Senna at the edge of the camp as the afternoon moved toward evening, standing at the spot on the ridge line where we had stood 9 days earlier. She was watching the empty tree line. The wolf with the notched ear was sitting beside her. She had her hand on his head without appearing to think about it, the way that people touch things they have come to rely on. I came and stood beside her. She did not turn. "Empty," she said. "Empty," I confirmed. We stood there for a while. The wind came off the ridge, cold and clean, carrying the smell of pine resin and far-off snow. Below us the camp was already taking on the different sound of a garrison that has stopped holding its breath, easier voices, the resumption of small habits, someone's laugh carrying from the fire ring. "The pass held," she said. "It did." She turned then and looked at me, and what was in her gray eyes was not the careful, still assessment of those first days. It was something fuller than that. The door had been opened. The woman behind it was not the bruised, stripped-down version of herself that 8 years on border roads alone had sometimes asked her to be. She was simply, quietly, completely herself. "Ask me," she said. I asked her. I asked her there on the ridgeline in the cold evening air, with the wolves settled in the grass below us, and the camp recovering its breath, and the eastern tree line empty of enemies for the first time in 2 weeks. I did not ask her in a hall. I did not ask her before an assembled pack in the formal language of claiming and lunarites. I had already said, 9 nights ago, everything that needed to be said about worth and choosing, and the difference between the seal on her wrist and the woman who wore it. What remained now was simply the question. She said yes. She said it the way she said most things, directly, without ceremony, with the entirety of her attention. And then she looked out at the valley one more time, and back at me, and something in her face shifted in the way that a winter landscape shifts when the light changes, the same features suddenly entirely different. "I don't know how to be a Luna," she said. "I don't know your counsel. I don't know your hold. I don't know anything about the history of the seal or what it requires of the person carrying it. I have spent 8 years moving between border settlements with a bag of medicinal herbs and a working knowledge of how to keep people from dying in cold weather." She paused. "I am going to make a great many mistakes." "Yes," I said. "So will I. We will make them together and correct them together, and none of the correcting will be done alone." She looked at me steadily. "That is an unusual way for a king to conduct himself." "I find," I said, "that it is the only way I'm interested in." In the months that followed, the council met and deliberated and issued its findings in the careful, layered language that councils use when they are ratifying something that has already happened and they know it. The historical claim was verified. Korath oversaw the formal recognition of the seal. The ceremony was quiet, private, not the production that the council's more ceremonially inclined members had wanted, because that was what Senna had asked for and what I had promised. The wolves attended. The gray wolf with the notched ear sat in the front of the hall and watched the proceedings with an expression that I can only describe as satisfied. The seal's formal witnessing took place on a morning in late winter in the hold's old ceremony hall, a room that had been used for exactly this purpose, according to Korath, 112 years ago, and had waited in its stone patience for the next occasion ever since. Senna stood at the center of the hall, and I stood beside her, and Korath spoke the old words, and the seal came up quiet and silver and unmistakable on Senna's wrist, and it came up on mine as well, the mate bond's answering mark, the one the histories described but that I had not, in honesty, entirely believed I would ever see on my own skin. The assembled witnesses went still in a way that had nothing performative about it. The silence was not the silence of ceremony observed. It was the silence of people in the presence of something they had been told was true and had, until that morning, carried only as a kind of inherited faith rather than direct knowledge. 3 of my most senior counselors, old men who had served my father and who approached everything with the considered skepticism of lifelong experience, were visibly moved. One of them wept, which I mention only because he had not, in my 22 years of working with him, wept at anything. Senna looked at the mark on my wrist, and then at her own, and then at me. "Still settling," she said quietly. which was not an old ceremony word and which made Korath's mouth twitch in the corner. Still settling, I agreed. The eastern corridor remained quiet. 3 months after the pass held, the enemy's command sent a delegation. The delegation did not contest the territory. The delegation came, it was later understood, to verify what they had been told, that the seal was awake, that the bearer stood with the king, that the calculation they had been running for 2 decades regarding the northern territories had been running on a false assumption. They saw what they needed to see. They went home. What none of them had been prepared for, what none of my council, my captains, or even Korath had fully anticipated, was Senna herself. They had expected, I think, a woman who would need to be educated into her position. A woman who would require patient guidance through the protocols and hierarchies of a Hold's administration, who would take years to grow into the weight of what the seal's recognition meant. They had expected that I would lead, and she would follow, and the process of becoming would be long and somewhat effortful for everyone involved. Senna asked questions instead. Constant, precise, bottomlessly practical questions, delivered without embarrassment and without the apologetic softening that people who feel out of their depth tend to apply to their ignorance. She did not know the council's procedural rules, she asked. She did not know the histories of the specific border territories under dispute, she asked. And then she read. And 3 weeks later she was posing follow-up questions that made my senior archivist flush with a pleasure he clearly had not experienced since his graduate years. She did not know the ceremonial expectations of the Holds that owed fealty to the crown. She asked each of the Hold leaders directly, in correspondence that was so straightforward and warm, and entirely without the formal distance that royal correspondence traditionally maintained, that the Hold leaders wrote back, without exception, rather more personally than the situation required. "They like her," Bren said to me, 6 months in, with an expression that mingled satisfaction with a kind of wonder. "She doesn't perform," I said. "They're not used to that." "Neither were you," he said, which was true and which I chose not to address. The council eventually found its peace with a Luna, who arrived knowing nothing about councils, and began asking questions with the same directness she had used on that first morning in the field. Not the diplomatic indirection that courts tend to run on, but the clear-eyed, practical honesty of a woman who had learned to solve problems in the places where the problems were actually happening, rather than the places where they were discussed. They found it disconcerting at first. They found it over time considerably more useful. What I found over time was something I did not have the language for in those first weeks at the pass, and that I do not intend to reduce to language now. I will say only this. She was right that she would make mistakes, and I was right that so would I, and neither of us was wrong that the correcting of them was better done together. I will say that the wolves chose her first, and the council chose her eventually, and the border settlements along Veldt, the communities where she had walked alone for 8 years, sent a delegation of their own 6 months after the recognition, not to the council but to her, with their own kind of ratification, which was a collection of dried herbs and a handwritten account of every person she had treated and the name of each one. She kept it. She keeps it still in a small wooden case on the shelf beside the window in her study. When I have asked her, occasionally, what it means to her, she says it means that the work was real, that the years counted, that they were not simply the road to the place where she arrived, they were themselves fully what they were. The border settlement at Veldt sent a second delegation a year later, this time a formal one, requesting that the Hold's medical records from the previous decade be reviewed, specifically the records pertaining to a midwife's daughter who had treated their people without charge and without affiliation for 8 years, and who had, in the opinion of the delegation's spokesman, a man of about 60 with a weathered face, and the careful speech of someone who has thought hard about what he wanted to say, saved at least 4 lives that the formal PAC Medical Corps would not have reached in time. They wanted it recorded. They wanted the Hold's histories to know that she had been there, among them, before anyone knew what she was. I sat beside Senna when the delegation spokesman made his case before the council, and I watched her face, and what I saw there was the careful, quiet expression of a woman receiving something she had not known she was waiting for, not recognition from the crown, not the seal's ancient sanction, not the council's ratification. Recognition from the people who had known her when she was only what she was, and for whom that had been enough. She thanked him with the same directness she gave everything. No elaborate speech, no ceremony. She said his name, which she remembered, and the names of 3 specific people she had treated in Velt, and she said she was glad to know the work had held. He went back to Velt with the hold's formal acknowledgement, and, I suspect, with the thing he had actually come for, which was the answer to whether she remembered. She remembered everything. I think about that sometimes when I am sitting across from her in the evenings, and the fire has burned down, and the wolves are asleep at our feet, and the pass is quiet, and the kingdom goes on in its slow, large, difficult life. I think about a woman on a frozen border road, 8 years alone, doing the work that was in front of her without the luxury of knowing that anything was coming. No bond declared, no seal awoken, no king on a battle horse riding toward her through the smoke of a repelled engagement. Just the work, and the steadiness she had built herself out of necessity, and the word her dying mother had left her as the only inheritance she had. The seal will know when it's time, don't fight it when it comes. She didn't, and neither in the end did I. The old seal is warm on my palm when I hold her hand, even now. It has never gone back to silence. It has no reason to.